Welcome, podcast listeners, to another episode of Apostolic Life in the 21st Century. As always, we are glad you have joined us. Today we want to talk about a subject that we have discussed on previous episodes. In fact, we have an entire playlist on YouTube dedicated to this subject, and that is the gifts of the Spirit. Today we're specifically going to be talking about the word of knowledge. Dr. Bernard, in the past you have explained each gift of the Spirit that Paul listed in 1 Corinthians. You've gone through and explained how those gifts operate. Today we want to dive back into another one of the gifts of the Spirit. Today we want to talk about the word of knowledge, which Paul, of course, mentions in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. What is the word of knowledge and how does it work?
Let's put this in the context. As you've indicated, in 1 Corinthians 12, Paul lists 9 gifts of the Spirit. In the context, these are not natural human abilities, but they're supernatural impartations. They come straight from God. They're miraculous in nature. Now, I think these are illustrative, not exhaustive, and I think we can try to define them, but I don't think we should seek rigid categories or definitions. There could be overlap. There could be some works of God that don't easily fit under any one or may fit 2 or more. So the point is not to get some kind of a technical scheme and try to pick your gift or give someone your gift or demand a gift. It's really trying to show the diversity of God's workings. And I really do believe that every Spirit-filled believer could manifest any of these gifts as the need arises. So it's not primarily for the individual, but it's for the benefit of the body. Now, in that context, 3 of the gifts are what we might refer to as the mind of Christ, because they seem to deal with the human mind being influenced by God's mind. That's the word of wisdom, the word of knowledge, discerning of spirits. So the word of knowledge, and notice the word of knowledge. So it's not all the knowledge of God, but it's a specific portion of knowledge. So I would define the word of knowledge as a specific impartation of information from God in a supernatural way. So in other words, it's knowledge from God. Other people might have that same knowledge, but the recipient doesn't have that knowledge and doesn't acquire it by natural means of study or someone telling him, but acquires it by revelation from God. And there could be an overlap with the word of wisdom, but the distinction I would make, wisdom is divine guidance. So when God gives you supernatural guidance of what to do in a situation or how to act, how to respond, to me that's the word of wisdom. When God supernaturally imparts some fact to you that again would help you in your decision or help you dealing with somebody, then that's the word of knowledge. Discerning of spirits would be more specifically when God gives you supernatural insight as to the motivation of something, whether it's the Spirit of God motivating something or a demonic spirit motivating something, or maybe the human spirit. Because a statement might be, it could be of God, it could be of the devil, it could be the human mind. Just the statement itself, you're not sure, but the discerning of spirits would give you the insight. So the word of knowledge is right there in the middle. I think a classic example would be in Acts chapter 5. The early church was raising money, and many people would sell their house or some land and donate it to the church for supporting needy people, supporting the ministry of the church. And of course, not everybody sold everything. You still, at a later time, they had houses to sell, and you find that the church met in Mark's mother's house, so she must have still had a house. They had house churches, so they still had houses. But many people sold at least some of their possessions and houses, lands, and that was seen as a commendable thing. So a couple, man and wife, Ananias and Sapphira, they sold some property, and they took the money and they brought it to give to the Apostle Peter, and as this is the total price of the property. But secretly, they decided to keep part of it back for themselves, which was okay. It was their property. But the problem was they lied for the sake of, I guess, glory and acclaim. And they presented, we're making this great sacrifice, when actually they were keeping a lot of it for themselves, only giving a portion. So maybe they sold it at a profit. Maybe they got their own investment back and they were just giving the extra to the church. So whatever it was, when they came and said, here's our offering, we sold this land and we're giving all of it to the church. Well, the Apostle Peter said, are you sure? Is that everything that you sold it for? And they said, yes. It was separately, so Ananias first, then Sapphira, but the same thing happened. And he said, you've lied. And you didn't lie to men, you've lied to the Holy Spirit, because part of that you kept back. And you had the right to do that. It was yours. It would be fine. You didn't have to give it all to the church, but you lied about it. And the judgment of God came. Both of them died, and that was a strict warning for the early church. Now, how did Peter know this? There's no evidence that somebody passed him a word saying, we were there when Ananias sold the property. So God directly revealed it to him. So that's what we would call a word of knowledge. In my book, I wrote a book called Spiritual Gifts. I discuss these 9 gifts of the Spirit. I give definitions, I give biblical examples, and then I give contemporary stories of my ministry or my parents' ministry where I think these gifts were in operation. So one story that my mom told me many years ago in Korea, she was traveling with some ministers. They were in a remote rural area near the seacoast, and then they were walking through the rice paddies to go to a church, and they got into a terrible snowstorm. They got completely disoriented, and they wandered around like 2 hours and couldn't find where they were supposed to go. It was near the sea, so they were concerned if they went the wrong direction, they could actually get into not only the danger from being lost and frozen in the snowstorm, but wandering off into the sea. And so after 2 hours of being totally lost in a blinding snow, they stopped and decided, where are we going to go? So my mother went aside and prayed, and she felt like God told her, here's the direction. So she told the other ministers, said, no, that's wrong. And they said, we calculate it's the opposite direction. But she kept insisting, and so they went the direction she said, and it took another hour, but they found the village and the church that they were looking for. So she felt like God gave her that knowledge. This is the right path. You could say a word of wisdom, but it seemed to be more not just guidance for handling a situation, but specific information that she needed in a time of trouble. So that would be a contemporary example, word of knowledge. I think often leaders, pastors, are using this gift maybe to deal with problems in a church. And sometimes opposition comes and you're puzzled, you can't understand what's going on, and then God shows you a person is a certain sin. And even though you may not, you probably don't want to reveal that to everybody, and maybe just keep it to yourself, it helps you to know how to deal with a situation, or maybe even to confront the person, like Ananias and Sapphira. Also, I think a word of wisdom could be, I've had this experience a number of times in praying personally with people, that I would be led to pray about specific things that just came to my mind. And later the person would say, how did you know I was going through that? Your prayer was exactly what I needed. I feel like even though I didn't realize it, God had given me a word of wisdom. That could also be, since it's spoken out to the person, that could be an overlap with prophecy. But I felt like God gave me knowledge, even though I didn't know how it applied, but it was very directly relevant. I even had an example. One time I was preaching, and this happened more than once probably, but one sticks out in my mind. So I was preaching, in the middle of my message, I started saying some things which were not my notes and were not even directly related to my text, but it was very pointed. And one time I didn't know who it was directed toward, but I knew it had to be some individual. And of course, I would never deliberately single out a person, through my personal knowledge. But another time I started speaking very strongly, and I felt God told me the person it was directed to, but it was not based on my counseling them or knowing about them, but I felt like God was very specifically giving that word to that person in the middle of my message, which nobody else would have known. I didn't try to identify the person or describe the person. And sure enough, after the service, the person came up to me and said, "What you said was right to me. I'm struggling with that situation, and what you said is directly for me." And so they confirmed it. I think that could also be a word of wisdom. So I was giving an example of how it could be embedded in a message, or how it could be in a personal conversation or personal prayer, or maybe even given to us personally for direction or decision. Or sometimes it may be to act. Sometimes it may be just to be aware so you can be on guard or be prepared or be ready for when this information becomes public, or when you must act in response to it. But it's definitely part of the work of God, the gifts of the Spirit. So I tend to think all of the gifts of the Spirit, there's a natural counterpart. So we have human knowledge that we can acquire through learning and study. And then there's a counterpart in our spiritual life. So we all need knowledge in our daily spiritual life. The book of Proverbs talks about the importance of acquiring both wisdom and knowledge. And so we study God's word. We might study management or personality. So there's strictly secular human knowledge that a sinner could know. There is spiritual and biblical knowledge that a Christian should know. But this third category is a specific, supernaturally imparted word of knowledge in a time of need to help God's people.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Apostolic Life in the 21st Century. If you enjoy this podcast, please take a moment to give us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to Dr. Bernard's channel, like this video, and leave a comment. We also encourage you to check out Dr. Bernard's books. Visit pentecostalpublishing.com and search for David Bernard to access a full list of titles. Don't forget to enter DKB10 at checkout to save 10% on your order. We look forward to seeing you again next week as we explore how modern-day believers can live out the teachings of the first century church.